The journey through Lent to Easter becomes a special time for all those who've been preparing to enter the church. And indeed, for all of us who journey along with them, this time is a special time of preparation for us as well. Okay? And so today we will celebrate both the call, the rite of election, okay, which the bishop is going to celebrate later today. But today, our two candidates who are going to become catechumens this afternoon are going to enroll their names in the Book of Life among us and then take that book to the bishop for recognition this afternoon at the cathedral. And then all the rest of those who, by virtue of their baptism, already won with us, but not completely won with us, we call them to continuing conversion, okay? Along with the rest of us during this Lenten time, that during that time of continuing conversion, the Lord is going to continue to turn your hearts closer and closer to what God wants for you, as all of us pray that that is what happens for all of us as well during Lent. I've said to you many times, you're doing this among a bunch of sinful people. You're doing it with a sinful pastor. And so if you're looking for perfection, you better keep looking. But I warrant to say you're not going to find it in the Christian tradition, and that's what our readings are here to remind us of today, okay? There is a certain inevitability in us as human beings to want to not let God be God. We want to be God instead. Several years ago, one of my students at Southeast Missouri State came up to me and said, and he was being very sincere because he was really on his journey of faith, trying to figure all this out and trying to figure out whether he wanted to continue to do this as a member of the Catholic Church, because as so often happens in college, you wind up getting bombarded with all kinds of different thoughts and possibilities. And suddenly for the first time in your life, you might be thinking, especially if you were coddled in Catholic schools for all those years, all right, is this right? This is the only thing I've ever heard. Do I want to do this? Is it what I want to choose? And we all have to get there. Each one of us has to come there in our own right as to when we make that choice to do this on our own, when it's not just the faith of our parents, but our own. And in his sincerity, he looked at me and he said, Father Jay, why didn't Jesus just do one thing that was so wonderful that everybody could believe? Then, now, throughout all of history, why couldn't Jesus have done just one thing to make us all believe so that we didn't have to search and we didn't have to journey and we didn't have to do all those things? And he was being very, very sincere because he was trying to figure out what he wanted to believe and what he wanted to follow. And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, well, some people will say he already did it, okay? That whole resurrection from the dead thing is pretty convincing. But that doesn't really matter to people unless they have a relationship with Jesus. So each one of us really, in our own right, has to figure out what our relationship with Jesus is and figure out how to live that according to our station in life. Okay? Whether we're a husband, a wife, a single person, a priest, religious, whoever we are, we have to, because of our baptism and the way we've responded to our baptismal call, we have to have that relationship with Jesus. And that relationship with Jesus has to be so great that it makes us want to be like him each and every day. That relationship is the one that has to color everything else that happens in our lives. And so I looked at him and I said, really the deal is that Jesus didn't do anything, I don't think, spectacular, super showy, kind of something so out of the ordinary, because if he had, he wouldn't have been living his own humanity. Because remember, Jesus is the truth about God and the truth about man, all in one person. And if you think you've got that figured out, well, congratulations. But it's one of the great mysteries of our faith, how all that exists in one person at the same time. The truth about God and the truth about humanity. And I said, when you stop worrying about, and I said, I'm just going to suggest you give up hope for some showy, spectacular miracle. If it happens, take it and run, but it's probably not going to happen that way. It's going to be in the everyday. And it's going to be in the everyday choices that you make. And it's going to be in the way that you live your life, in imitation of Jesus and in that relationship with him that's going to do that. Because when you figure that out, I said what you're going to figure out at that point in time is that a miracle is not going to cause your faith, but that your faith is going to cause all kinds of miracles in your life. And he gave me that confused look that I so often get from students. And I knew that once again I had succeeded as I sent him on his way. Because he just has to go and figure it out for himself. I'd love to be the answer man. I'd love to give you every answer to every question that's ever been asked. I'd love to take out all the doubt in your life. I'd love to do all those things, but I can't do that for you. Jesus is the only one that can do that for you. And only if you give yourself over to that relationship will that relationship matter enough to have you make whatever choices it is you're going to make. And sometimes when you make them, you're still going to be questioning yourself and saying, is this right? And I got news for you. When you start asking yourself those questions, you really are living faith. Okay? It's no longer Catholic conveyor belt. You'll be living faith. And so I do want to call you to that continuing conversion today. And I want to call the whole community to the continuing conversion today. That is what our Lenten journey is for. That is what our readings remind us today. Okay, of why we're on the journey. We were not content to let God be God and be ourselves. And that's where we got ourselves into trouble. That's where that original sin comes from. It's because we were not content to let God be God. And we were not content to be who we're called to be. Instead, we wanted to be God. And so we messed the whole thing up. We introduced sin into the world. And sometimes my students will also argue with me and say, well, why does that original sin involve me? I didn't make that sin. Well, just wait long enough, you will. We all do. There's that inevitability to sin in our lives, and it's the reality. And what Romans tells us, and I love the book of Romans, because beyond any other piece of literature in our scriptures, what Romans reminds us is that no matter how hard you try, you're never going to earn God's love. Now, how much you try to justify yourself by your actions and whatever it is that you're going to try to justify yourselves, you can't justify yourselves. We were lost in our sin. We were lost in our sin, and we chose to get lost. And you all know in our worst moments, we still sometimes choose to get lost. But the reminder to all of us is that we don't save ourselves. Jesus is the one who saves us. Jesus is the one out of love for us that as sin entered the world, so now he comes into the world and he chooses not to sin. You see, that humanity that he chooses is again what he's tempted about in the gospel today. And always on this first Sunday of Lent, regardless of the year, we get the temptation stories that Jesus too was tempted. Why is that in all of our scriptures? It's in there so many times because somewhere along the way, Jesus had to determine, I'm going to do this way rather than any other way. Again, could Jesus have done it with some mighty show of power? Could he have done it with some miracle? Yes, but that's not the way he chose to do it. He chose to do it according to the Father's will, which at sometimes was not his will, okay? Or at least he was fighting it because he didn't like all of what was being asked of him. And he kept saying to the Father, Father, let this cup pass me by, if you will. But if you're not willing to do it, then your will, not my will, be done. See, Jesus knew that fundamental part about being human, even though he was God at the same time. And that was, he was willing to let God be God, and he was willing to accept his humanity and to live it to the full. And that's why Jesus turns down the temptation to fill himself up, to not be hungry. Don't you ever find that line funny? He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and then he found out he was hungry. I love it. He knew his emptiness. He knew his hunger, but he wasn't willing to fill it up with anything except by God and God's word. He knew he could have the show of power. He knew he could have jumped down from the temple and been fine. He knew he could have dominated and governed the whole world, but he did choose to do it that way? No. He chose to do it as a regular human being in relationship with other human beings. And that's where we have to learn how to do it. It's not going to be in some super showy way. It's going to be in the everyday, in the ordinary. That is where we will find our God. And that is where we will turn our wills over to God day by day through our prayer, through our emptying ourselves out, and through our taking care of other people. Those are our Lenten practices. Those are the things we strive for. Those are the normal, everyday ways that we are reminded that God is God and that we are not. That is our continuing call to conversion. That is what the Lord calls us to. And so, if indeed we can live our Lent through those holy and joy-filled practices, then we will indeed resist the temptations that come before us as well. And we will allow God to be God. And we will be content with being who we're called to be. And the angels will come and minister to us as well.